Chapter 17. Kushina stopped charging forward as she saw a huge, purple thing appear around her best friend. She wasn't sure what it was, but the chakra which formed the monstrosity appeared to completely encircle Makoto and formed some sort of skeleton, the likes of which was nothing she had ever seen before. Makoto had shouted out the word Susanoo, apparently the name of this new technique. Strangely, Kushina had never seen her best friend perform it before now, though she was aware of rumors that the Sharingan could let the Uchiha do some strange things. Whatever it was, the chakra pressure from her best friend was steadily increasing. But it felt dark and tainted. The redhead was somewhat adept at sensing chakra signatures, and Makoto's was doing yet another thing she had never felt before now. Any further thoughts on the subject were cut short as the purple skeleton moved, swinging a strange-looking sword in a wide downward arc. It didn't impact the ground, but it did force the masked man to take several quick hops backwards so that he wouldn't be hit. Kushina. Startled, it took the redhead a moment to realize that Makoto was calling her name. Why yeah, Makoto ni? Get Naruto out of here. Please. Kushina quickly darted forward, trying to pretend that she didn't hear Makoto's voice break when she said Naruto's name. Coming to an abrupt halt at the blonde's prone form, she tried to hold back her grief at the sight until he was moved out of the way from whatever it was that his wife wanted to do. Carefully shifting him so as to not potentially make his seemingly lethal injury worse, she moved her hands and arms under his shoulder blades and knees. Boosting her strength and speed with chakra reinforcement, the redhead grunted for a moment as she adjusted to his extra weight while trying not to stare at the sword in his chest, then quickly moved over to the far side of the clearing. She kept an eye on the masked man, though to both her relief and worry he appeared to be more interested in what Makoto was doing. Glancing at her friend once again, she noticed that her Susanoo was no longer a skeleton but appeared to be fully fleshed out with a face that looked to have a cruel grimace on it. The sword it was holding was now somehow alight with what looked to be fire. But it was black and didn't give off any light, yet something else she had never seen before. Makoto let out a yell and moved forward, but Kushina forced herself to stop watching for a moment as she set Naruto carefully back down on the ground. The sword was still in him, unfortunately she was afraid to move it as it might cause more damage or cause him to start bleeding in earnest. Clumsily pressing her shaking fingers against the side of his throat, she finally lost the battle with her tears as she searched in vain for a heartbeat. As if the sword sticking out from his chest didn't send enough of a message. Kurama. Can you think of or do anything? There was a brief rumbling in the back of her mind before the deep voice of the Nine Tails became clear. Lift up his shirt and place your hand against the seal on his stomach. If his chakra network is at all still active, I may be able to sustain him with chakra alone for a little while until a medic gets here. The redhead didn't need to be told twice, as she immediately unzipped his bloodstained Jonin vest, then quickly lifted up the mesh underlay while trying to ignore the quickly crusting blood that had run down his chest towards his abdomen. Placing her hand directly over his navel, she pumped as much of both her own and Kurama's chakra into the seal as she could. At first, there was a spark of hope as the hidden seal on Naruto's stomach immediately appeared. The dark spiral was a sharp contrast to his quickly paling skin. A loud yell from Makoto and a large explosion almost sent both her and Naruto flying, but some quick chakra adjustments kept her stuck to the ground while holding onto and protecting what she could of her brother's body. She wasn't able to tell what Kurama was doing, but as the seconds turned into a minute and then two, despair once more began to set in. She had tried focusing on what Makoto and the masked man were talking and yelling to each other about over the explosions, but her mind seemed to be unable to focus on any one task. It was when the Nine Tails spoke again, however, that the world around her seemed to stop existing as reality was brought to a fine point directly in front of her. I'm sorry Kushina, there's nothing I can do. Kurama's deep voice rumbled in her mind. Believe me, I wish I could. That pronouncement was followed by a deep sigh. I have only ever wished for three things in my long life. That the old man didn't have to die, that I had my freedom from being used as a tool for many years. And now this. Kushina wanted to wail, to scream and yell, to let the world know about her loss. But for the moment, all she could feel was numb. Even though he was dead and still had the sword stuck through the middle of his torso, she removed her hand from his abdomen and instead cradled his head in her lap as if it were a precious and delicate object. Another loud commotion brought her half-hearted attention back to the fight between her best friend and her brother's killer, but a voice she had never heard before spoke up behind her before she could figure out what was going on. What happened here? Naruto POV. Naruto blinked as his eyes opened. Or at least he thought he blinked. It was hard to tell, as it was completely black around him, and there wasn't any light as far as he could tell. Looking down, he realized that he could see himself, as if he was a light source. Though he didn't appear to give off any ambient light as he couldn't see anything else around him. Unlike being stuck in Madara's world, as he had come to call it, there were no large pillars of white all around him either. It was a total void. There was nothing but darkness for as far as he could see, not to mention for all intents and purposes the surface he was standing on was invisible as well. Trying to assess his situation, he replayed his most recent memories in his mind. He was hit with a sharp pain in his head and crumpled to his knees as what he believed to be the last moments of his life, replayed with almost painful clarity. One moment, he was exhausted and tired, but unable to sleep for some reason in Madara's world. Though there was no way to tell how much time had passed in that place, it felt like an eternity. It was as if something was giving him the energy to stay awake, while at the same time making sleep impossible as a result. It was maddening, and if he had been stuck in there any longer he might have truly gone mad before long. That was one of the reasons why when he felt the sudden twist of his reality being changed, he was at first excited to meet that change, regardless of where it would put him. As his vision had stabilized in the new area, a blue sky was the first thing he saw, and his heart leaped at the sight. Then he noticed how much brighter it all was and moved to shield his eyes from the sunlight that he hadn't seen in what felt like forever. His squinting eyes rested on Mikoto for barely a second before he heard Madara's voice behind him. The blonde couldn't remember what the man said exactly, as there was a sharp pain in the middle of his chest. He watched as his wife's face morphed from amazement to fear, then to panic, and finally what appeared to be grief mixed with anger in what was likely a span of a couple seconds. At first it confused him, but then the pain from his chest got worse, and he looked down, only to see a sword sticking out of it. Darkness quickly started seeping up from the corners of his vision, and before he knew it, he could no longer find the strength to remain standing. Naruto's eyes had closed completely at some point, though his mind was fuzzy on exactly when. In actuality, it felt like he simply closed his eyes for a brief moment before he opened them again to find himself where he was now, standing up once more. The moment he wondered what to do now, a faint sound resembling a laugh came from behind him. Quickly turning around, he examined the area, only to see what appeared to be a faint light off in the distance. It was impossible to tell just how far away it was, but looking around one more time made him realize that there really wasn't anything else he could see. Steeling himself as he let out a sigh, the blonde took a step forward, followed by another, slowly making his way towards the light. He was unsure as to if there was an end anywhere to the apparently non-existent surface he was walking on, but as Naruto continued his travels towards the light, his mind began wandering towards the what-ifs. Such as, what if this is what people referred to when they were dying or dead as walking towards the light? He began to ponder different scenarios as he got closer, only for his thoughts to lean more towards curiosity as the one light he originally saw became two, and then several more after that. By the time he got close enough to identify the various lights, however, he just knew his eyes had to be playing tricks on him. The scene was surprisingly familiar, in an eerie sort of way. There were plenty of little things that just made the entire thing appear wrong, as though someone had changed a few minor details here and there just to try to mess him up. The worst part about it all was the two people sitting at the table in front of him, both of them giving him small, reserved smiles while obviously waiting for him to talk first. After staring at them for a few seconds, he took a deep breath and realized that he would have to be the one to make the first move. Minato? Kushina? What are you two doing here? Mikoto POV. Mikoto screamed in frustration as her Amaterasu-coated sword once again went right through the masked man's body without him having to dodge at all. It was as if she was just swinging through air. Well. For being the current leader of the clan, I must admit I was expecting more than this. She knew deep down he was just goading her on. At this point, she just didn't care. There was only one objective she had right now, and that was to see the man in front of her die. Even if she died along the way, he was going down. Her thoughts briefly turned to Itachi and her friends. She knew that Kushina and Minato would raise Itachi well, and they would certainly get help from the clan. But the monster in front of her had to die, because if he didn't, no one would be safe. Naruto's passion to see this man dead to save everyone else had been cemented in her long ago. He never directly asked her to help him, but he was so passionate about it. Especially after hearing the horror stories of his time. That she couldn't help but get swept up in it as well. She didn't want to die. No one did, at least no one that she knew of. Mikoto wasn't afraid of death, but that wasn't to say she was actively seeking it either. Judging by the hard time she was having so far, however, it was unlikely she'd make it through this in one piece. The Uchiha matriarch was a realist, it was one of the things that Naruto always claimed to love about her. Of course, thoughts of her recently deceased husband reignited her rage, and she felt another burst of power surge through her system. That's better. Come now, let's dance a little. The raven-haired woman tried to lay a multi-layered genjutsu on the area, though against her opponent she had no idea if it would work. When she sent another bolt of black fire at him, and he dodged this time, she guessed it might have been working a little, as he made an effort to move this time instead of letting it go right through him. Any further considerations were cut short as he pulled a battle fan out of nowhere and seemed to glide through the air, taking a swing at her. She brought the sword of her Susanoo around to deflect the blow, but much to her surprise she was pushed back instead of stopping his momentum. He chuckled as he glided down to the ground. "Do you know who I am, woman?" Mikoto glared at the man as she panted slightly. Her cheeks were both itching, so she wiped at them, only to see the back of her hand come away bloody. "I think it's fairly obvious who you are, bastard." To her displeasure, he simply chuckled again and shook his head, then reached up and pulled off the mask, tossing it to the ground. "Well, since I'm guessing the dead blonde told everyone who I am at this point, I no longer need to hide my face. It's much earlier than I had planned, but I guess I might as well start my conquests today by killing you and sending the Uchiha clan into disarray." Mikoto continued to glare at Madara. Konoha is much stronger than just the Uchiha. He leaped forward again, surprising her by getting inside her guard and smashing his fan against Susanoo's chest. Mikoto yelped in pain as it felt like a blow against her own chest, even if it was probably blunted. Her technique flickered for a moment as she was sent crashing into a nearby tree. "You give that village too much credit. It's nothing but a shadow of its once brief, great existence." Hashirama began to dilute its power as he tried to elevate the status of every other village out there. Madara slowly stalked forward as Mikoto gradually climbed back to her feet, Susanoo quickly solidifying around her once more. "Perhaps I will give you one chance. Impress me enough, and I'll allow you to join my side on the quest for permanent peace." Mikoto wasn't sure what he was expecting, but judging by the look on Madara's face when she did it, he didn't believe she would burst out laughing. Even if her ribs were already hurting, it was worth it just for that sight alone. "I wouldn't follow you in a million years," she chuckled. "Your peace is meaningless because no one will have free will." She wasn't entirely sure, but it sounded for a moment like Madara actually growled. She wasn't able to bask in the moment for long, however, as he came charging at her once again. Naruto POV. The two sitting at the table in front of Naruto glanced at each other for a moment, seemingly sharing a conversation in their minds, before one of them chuckled and slowly rose from the table. "Well, I can't say I recall any other child calling their parents by their name in such a manner, but if it's what you're comfortable with, I guess I can let it slide for now." The redhead stopped a couple short paces away from Naruto, giving him a slight smile as her head tilted a little to the side. The way she was standing and looking at him expectantly, combined with the clothing she was wearing. The Kushina in his time hadn't worn anything like that yet. Mom?" She nodded slowly before opening her arms, and in barely more than a second he had moved forward to embrace her tightly. As much as he tried to stop them, he could feel the tears working their way into the corners of his eyes. A rather loud sniff from him caused his mother to chuckle as she stepped back from him. "Are you really going to cry? It's not like it's been that long since you saw me, you know?" Naruto's eyes went wide before they quickly narrowed in confusion. "Wait, aren't you? If you're my mother, then..." Catching him by surprise, this time it was Minato who answered him. "What your mother means, Naruto, is that we're your parents from your original timeline." Naruto looked back and forth between his parents, noticing that they did look slightly older than he remembered them from where he was from. It answered some questions, but started a whole lot more too. "How?" Minato and Kushina looked at each other again before shrugging. "We aren't sure either," his mother answered. "We can't remember anything before arriving right here. Strangely, we didn't really feel like it had been all that long since we saw each other, and it feels like I just saw you moments ago trying to take control of the Kyuubi." Naruto stared at his mother curiously as she gestured to an empty chair at the table as she moved back towards her own. Without a word he moved over and sat down, only to look back and forth between his parents curiously for another moment. His eyes briefly passed over other areas of the room they were in, taking in as many details as he could. There were 3 walls, a floor, and even a ceiling and a window that showed what he recognized as Konoha on a sunny day. All that was missing was the wall from where he entered. The room itself was literally a carbon copy of Minato's, the younger one, current apartment, minus a few little changes here and there. "So, Naruto scratched at his cheek for a moment, trying to figure out what to ask. "Are you too aware of how I got here?" The mood at the table immediately adopted a rather somber tone, both of his parents nodding, while his father looked distinctly unhappy. "You were killed, as best we can tell," his father explained. "I don't know how, but we were given a sort of strange third-person's view about most of the major events in your life up until this moment." Kushina nodded as her husband spoke, though in contrast to him, she looked to be having a hard time keeping a straight face. Naruto noticed, and when he simply raised an eyebrow, she couldn't help but grin. "Mikoto ni, Naruto? Really?" Even though they had been married for a while, Naruto felt himself rubbing at the back of his head as a blush started creeping up his face. "Hey now, it just sort of happened. I honestly wasn't trying." He stopped talking as Kushina failed to keep a hold on her giggles. Naruto's abashed face quickly transformed into a mild scowl, while Minato simply looked on with a small, amused smile. "I think that she's very happy for the both of you, though she doesn't know quite how to express that." Kushina hummed and nodded happily as Minato continued, "While I have to admit thinking of it as, well, odd, the Mikoto I knew and was on a Genin team with did end up in a marriage with Fugaku. The Mikoto you and our alternate selves know is definitely much, much happier." "Really?" Naruto asked, looking happy again. Both of his parents nodded with smiles on their faces, but it was Kushina who answered him. "Thank you for saving my best friend, Naruto. My Mikoto only had flashes of happiness, and that was mostly when it was just her and Itachi. It was wonderful to see that I didn't lose my friend this time." He wasn't sure what to say, but instead settled for returning the smile. In fact, he really wasn't sure what more to talk about at all just yet. His death had been so sudden, and he was still trying to piece it all together. When something fluttered by the window, however, his eyes were immediately drawn to it, looking outside. It didn't take long for his attention to shift from the window over to the door next to it. Getting curious, he looked around the room again, noticing that other than the wall that was absent, so were 2 more doors that he knew led to the bedroom and a storage closet. "What is it?" Naruto's head turned back to look at Minato, who had asked the question. At first he just shrugged, but when his father's penetrating stare didn't let up, he figured that he should probably explain. "I was just wondering why there is a window and a door on that wall, but 2 other doors from this room are missing. Not to mention the entire wall from where I entered." Once again his parents shared a look between them, and much like last time, Kushina answered, "You don't want to go through that door, Naruto." "What? Why?" Kushina's face went through a collection of expressions as her mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. "What I think your mother is trying to say and failing at," Minato managed to ignore the red head as she sent him a glare, "is that we both know and yet don't know what is behind the door. It has a strong sense of familiarity, yet at the same time I don't really know what's beyond there. All I do know is that when I woke up here, I had a strong urge to keep you from entering." "He's right, Naruto." As the young man turned back to look at his mother, she only offered him a sad smile. "We discussed this briefly, but as far as we can tell we're here to stop you from going any further just yet. The only thing we don't know is why." Kushina stared with wide eyes at the young man standing next to her. He was rather gaunt looking, so she had a hard time guessing his age, but would place it to be somewhere in his late 20s to early 30s. Other than that, there were 2 other things that really stood out to her. First was that he had red hair that came down to his shoulders. Secondly was his eyes. They were like nothing she had ever seen before, yet at the same time they matched up with the exact same rumors she had heard of passed down from her ancestors. Rumors that Mikoto and Naruto had surprisingly decided to confirm were correct, but neither of them really explained anything more beyond confirmation of existence before the subject was dropped or changed. She didn't really remember, and now wasn't the time for introspection. "Wah, who are you?" The new arrival stared at her for barely a moment before his unique eyes shifted from her to the body in front of her. I was one of Jiraiya-sensei's first students, though I understand he hadn't told anyone of us other than his own teammates. He got me to come here by telling me a rather fantastic story, including some facts that he felt I had to see to truly believe. If he was going to say anything more, it was cut off by yet another arrival. Kushina. Hearing Minato's voice, she tensed, turning her tear-stained face to look at her boyfriend. At first he was looking worried, but as he ran closer she could see it quickly morph from disbelief to shock as he got closer. Minato completely ignored the other redhead, so she could only guess that he already knew. It wasn't long before his gaze shifted from her to Naruto. "What happened?" he asked. It looked like he was doing everything he could to rein in all the emotions he was feeling, but it was quickly failing. Madara. She couldn't keep the slight hiccup out of her voice as she came close to bursting into tears again, one of her hands gripping tightly onto Naruto's vest. All it took was that one name for Minato's eyes to snap quickly into focus as his anger surged to the forefront. Kushina watched as his hands rapidly clenched and released, while at the same time his lips morphed into a snarl that she had never seen him have before. With a look over his shoulder to where Mikoto and Madara were still fighting, he murmured that he'd be back before disappearing in a flash of yellow. The throat clearing brought Kushina's head back around to the front, only to stare at the other redhead once again. Instead of looking up at him as before, however, he had since crouched down and had a hand resting on Naruto's chest. "As I was saying before, Jiraiya-sensei mentioned that I might want to come here to meet some people that I thought I no longer had." His gaze shifted from Naruto's form to her face. "Judging from the color of your hair, as well as what Jiraiya-sensei has told me, you must be Uzumaki Kushina." Kushina simply blinked, then slowly nodded. The newcomer returned the gesture before looking back down and asking another question. "Who is this?" "My brother. Naruto." The other man's lips pressed into a fine line as he stared at the sword still sticking out of Naruto's chest. "Can you lift up his torso? We need to get this sword out of him." Kushina simply stared at the other man, blinking owlishly before her hands clenched against Naruto's vest once again, unconsciously pulling his body closer in a possessive gesture. The man must have noticed this, as he sighed a little before looking her in the eyes. "I came here in search of family. My name is Uzumaki Nagato." Kushina simply blinked at him, again. She looked down at Naruto again, briefly, before shifting back up to stare at Nagato once more. As if knowing Kushina wasn't altogether at the moment, the other redhead offered her a somewhat small, reassuring smile. "Don't worry, I'm a medic." Mikoto POV. Mikoto groaned as she struggled to pick herself back up. Her Susanoo technique was starting to flicker and fade around its extremities, not to mention it had switched back to a skeletal figure. While she still felt as though she had the power to handle it, she wasn't sure if her body could take much more. As she tried to climb back up to her feet, her right knee gave out on her, causing her to stumble back to the ground. Hearing the faint sound of Madara chuckling once again, she couldn't help but growl quietly. The man was downright infuriating. Out of her peripheral vision she noticed as he casually moved over a pile of random rubble, lifting a foot and placing it on a felled tree trunk. Leaning forward and resting the arm that wasn't holding his battle fan on top of his thigh, he peered over at her. "I have to admit, you've put up a better fight than I thought you would. You have my begrudging respect, though you are still nowhere near my level. Or Hashirama's for that matter." She idly wondered what a dead man had to do with any of this, though the stories of how many times the two men fought to a stalemate popped into the forefront of her mind. Not to mention the battle at what they named the Valley of the End. Grunting, she slowly managed to climb back to her feet, reinforcing her bad knee with chakra so that it hopefully wouldn't give out on her again. "Ready for more? Very well, let's." Madara's comments were cut off as he quickly phased out of existence, a yellow blur passing directly through him, coming to a stop next to Mikoto, but still outside of the glowing aura of Susanoo. "Mikoto? You need to go. Everyone's coming, I'll take care of this for now until they get here." Mikoto turned her head and glared at her old friend and teammate, actually causing him to take a half step backward. "Like hell I'm going anywhere. This bastard killed my husband. But you're in no shape to." Minato had to flash away as Madara brought his fan down, right where the blonde had been standing, causing the ground to crack open slightly and making Mikoto stumble backwards. Now, children," Madara chastised, "you shouldn't ignore your betters. That's very rude." Several kunai impacted the ground near where Madara was standing, and as the man looked down at them there were several flashes of yellow that surrounded him. Mikoto could barely follow, but it appeared as if the aged Uchiha blocked some attacks with his fan while still phasing out of existence for others. To Mikoto's shock and horror, Madara simply swung his fan at one point, and it managed to hit Minato, obviously stunning the blonde as he let out a yell and went flying, crashing into the ground and tumbling a couple more times until he came to a stop, groaning. Well, I have to admit, that was a lucky hit. Now for a finisher. How about Amaterasu? Mikoto moved as quickly as she was able, sticking out the sword of her Susanoo so that Madara's Amaterasu was absorbed harmlessly into hers, protecting a Minato who had stopped about halfway from getting to his feet as he stared at the large sword of fire that had just protected him. How do you know Amaterasu? Madara simply stared at her for a moment before shaking his head. The clan must have fallen further than I thought. A retort was on the tip of Mikoto's tongue, but a glare and a sudden shot of killing intent almost made her bite her tongue in shock. Just how powerful was this man? It was like there was no end to what he was capable of. As I was going to say before you were about to interrupt me, the Sharingan is an amazing tool. When my brother died and I took his eyes, not only did I get my sight back, but I also got every technique that he learned using his eyes. It's as if they have a memory of their own. Not only that, but the Eternal Mangekyo Sharingan has the ability to copy and use the ability of any other Mangekyo Sharingan. Another amazing thing is that there are several techniques that every Uchiha starts with that they will automatically know how to use when the situation arises, the least of which are Amaterasu, Tsukuyomi, and Susanoo. Didn't you ever wonder? The smile on Madara's face was nearly feral, it sent shivers down Mikoto's spine. She actually hadn't seen him with even a hint of one on his face before now. She didn't like it. At all. She knew what Tsukuyomi was thanks to Naruto, but her husband didn't know how to perform it. He had only been brought into it before. The tablet in the Uchiha shrine mentioned that there were 5 techniques gifted to every pair of eyes, but not what they were. Her eyes couldn't read the entire tablet anyway, so there may have been a description elsewhere. There was a lot that Naruto had shared with her, courtesy of the Itachi from his time, but since he didn't have the Sharingan he couldn't apply any of it and show her. The arrival of more people to the current battlefield broke Mikoto's current train of thought, and one of the first things she noticed was that Madara's expression had evened out again. Taking a quick look around, she saw that the Sandaime Hokage had landed next to her and was alternating between examining what she was doing and trying to gauge what had been going on in the area around them. On her other side, both of the Hokage's old teammates and current advisors landed. A little in front of her, and off to the side she spotted both Shimura Danzo, Hataka Sakumo, and several members of Anbu. To the other side was the members of the Densetsu no Sanin, Jiraiya, Sanada, and Orochimaru. Altogether, they had pinned Madara into the center of their formation, though to Mikoto's quickly growing horror the Uchiha didn't look worried in the least. In contrast, he was actually starting to look amused. "What are you doing, Madara? We thought you were dead." Mikoto heard the Hokage shout out from next to her. As usual, the man simply chuckled. As if Hashirama could truly finish me. The man was truly too kind-hearted for his own good. Your age has long since passed. You should not be here anymore. This time, Madara simply snorted. My age will never pass. Not until I achieve the ultimate peace. Peace through power. I'll become a god, if I have to, and I'll be making you my first subjects. As if to put an exclamation point on his speech, he stared right at Mikoto and smirked. First, though, I need to take out the trash. The current Uchiha matriarch heard several shouts, a few of which were her name, but she was paying more attention to a rather pronounced whisper in her head. She didn't have much time to contemplate it, however, before she let out a scream as she found herself being hit by a large, blunt object and was promptly sent sailing backward. She let out another strangled cry as her back impacted against something that she hoped was a tree because of how loud the cracking noise was. The whisper in her mind grew louder right before her body went numb, and she quickly succumbed to the darkness. Naruto POV. So you don't know what it is, but I'm not supposed to go there? What the hell am I supposed to do then? We don't know, sorry. But we're under the impression that it isn't quite your time to move on just yet. Naruto rubbed his face with his hands, feeling rather incredulous about this entire situation. On one hand he was upset to know that he was dead, leaving behind a vulnerable Mikoto, Itachi, and Konoha. Sure, he had made it stronger, but he was expecting to have a few more years yet before he'd actually have to deal with the threat that was Madara and the Akatsuki. On the other hand, it was nice that he got to meet both of his real parents for a change, even if he had long gotten over the feeling that he'd likely never see them again. This current arrangement came as a pleasant surprise in that aspect. But now he was essentially stuck in limbo. Unable to move on, but not aware of any way to get back either. In a rather strange twist of fate, his parents weren't of much help either. Right as another question was about to leave his mouth, both of his parents looked sharply out into the vast blackness that was outside the little room. "Do you feel that, Kushina?" His mother simply nodded before standing up from the table and quickly moving over to grab Naruto in a quick hug. "Mom?" She pulled back, tears forming in the corner of her eyes. "It seems your time has come to return." Naruto's eyes widened a bit and he looked around her into the vast expanse, but not seeing anything. "Are you sure?" "I don't see anything." "We're sure." "I don't know how, but I for one can just feel it," Minato commented. Naruto stood and looked to his father, who had also moved over to him and was holding out one of his hands. As he grabbed Minato's hand, the slightly older man pulled his son into a one-armed hug. "I don't think it really needs to be said, but we just want you to know that we're both incredibly proud of you." Naruto felt his own eyes beginning to tear up as he stepped back from his father. Kushina moved over and placed her arm around Minato's waist while he placed one over her shoulder. "When you get back and kick Madara's ass, make sure you give me lots more grandbabies after, okay?" Her son simply blinked at her owlishly for a moment before a small grin crossed his face. "How many?" Kushina pretended to think. "Oh, I don't know. 9 total, perhaps?" The two of them shared a smile as Minato snorted and rolled his eyes. Almost immediately after, Naruto found his body to be surrounded by a white glow that was steadily growing brighter. Realizing that this was what his parents sensed, he waved goodbye, to which they did the same in return with their free hands. As Naruto closed his eyes, when the light got too bright, the last thing he heard was his mother shouting that she loved him and that she'd better not see him again too soon. Kushina POV. Kushina watched fretfully as her kinsman performed some strange technique after pulling the sword of Naruto's body. She didn't actually see anything happen, but shortly after he did it, a green glow surrounded the blonde, followed immediately by his mouth opening as he took a deep breath. It was all the redhead could do to keep from squealing in both shock and joy, but somehow she managed. With a grateful glance at a slightly tired-looking Nagato, she propped Naruto's head up into her lap as she waited for him to open his eyes. Thankfully, it didn't take long. "Ugh, what hit me?" The young woman felt the tears start to fall from her eyes again, though this time it was in happiness rather than sadness. As Naruto's bright blue eyes opened, she tried to smile for him, but her lips were trembling too much to pull it off. As if sensing her feelings, the blonde surprised himself at how quickly he was able to shift to his knees and pull her into a hug just as she began bawling into his chest. Feeling horrible for the shock he must have put her through, not to mention Makoto, he began to take stock of the situation as he tried to figure out where his wife currently was. Before he got very far, however, another presence moved around into his line of sight. Naruto found himself doing a double take as he gaped for a moment. "Nagato?" The redhead gave him a tight smile and a brief nod. "It would seem that what Jiraiya-sensei told me is true." Naruto blinked at him for a moment before what really happened dawned on him. "You used Rin-tensei, didn't you?" Nagato appeared to be momentarily surprised before nodding once again. "Thanks." The other redhead offered a small shrug this time. "It's the least I could do for another Uzumaki." That brought Naruto up short. After all this time, it had never crossed his mind. Konan never said anything, so perhaps the Nagato from his time never told her his family name. "You're one too?" All Nagato did was point at his hair, as if that was enough of an answer. "Right. I'm an idiot." He both felt and heard Kushina giggle against his chest, which served as a quick reminder that he was still holding her. Leaning back slightly as he released her, she made a show of wiping away at her face to clean it up before giving him a fierce stare. "Don't you ever do that to me, or anyone else, ever again." The blonde simply gave her a flat look before sighing and shaking his head. "I don't know if anyone can ever make that promise, but I can promise to put forth my best effort." Kushina gave him a timid smile before sighing. "I guess that is all anyone can hope for." The moment she finished speaking, a large explosion made the three of them look in the direction of the source, only to see a massive amount of fire and water being thrown about, along with a lot of debris. The fight was definitely still going on. "Well, perhaps we should go help them take care of Madara." Are you ready to fight with Kyuubi? Kushina looked pensive for a moment before her face settled on a determined expression, and she nodded quickly. Naruto returned the nod as he rose to his feet, offering his hand to his sister to help her up as well. Upon standing up completely, he turned to Nagato. If you want to stay here and out of the fight, I'd understand. As much as we could use your help, this isn't really your battle. To his surprise, Nagato offered a small smile and shook his head negatively. Actually, the reason Madara is here now is mostly my fault. I will help you as well, though I admit I'm not as good a ninja as my two best friends. My eyes just allow me to do different things. Wait. What do you mean you're responsible for Madara being here? Nagato looked away towards where the battle was happening for a few brief seconds before staring at Naruto once again. It was just under 2 years ago, I think. He sent a messenger of some sort to bring me to his location. I was curious about his message, so I went. When I first saw him, he was an old man and claimed that he was the one who had given me these eyes when I was younger. I didn't believe him at first, but he managed to convince me since he was able to tell me my entire family history. Supposedly I was given these eyes when I was 3. He mentioned the Rin Tensei to me, but wasn't surprised that I already knew the technique. He claimed if I resurrected him into a new body he had prepared after he died, that he would help me attain the peace I long for. Nagato trailed off for a moment, looking back and forth between Naruto and Kushina, realizing that they were totally engrossed with his story so far. Taking a deep breath, he continued, so I did it. I haven't heard from him since I brought him back, but he claimed that he had quite a few plans to put into motion first. Then Jiraiya-sensei arrived. I was happy to see him, of course, it had been a while. Until he started explaining what was really going on. At first I didn't want to listen to him, but gradually what he was telling me began making too much sense. Then when we were alone, he confirmed Naruto was from the future and really knew what was going on, and that I still had family, living blood relatives, here in Konoha. Nagato made a slow, sweeping gesture around them. Now. Here I am. I suggest that we get moving before Madara does too much more damage. Battlefield. Madara held his battle fan in a relaxed pose as he examined his surroundings. After dealing with the current Uchiha clan head and the upstart Yondaime Hokage, the others were making things difficult, but not to any large extent. It was definitely no warm-up, other than some phasing. He hadn't even had to resort to his other Mangekyo Sharingan abilities again since he last used Amaterasu. There were quite a few injured and perhaps dead bodies laying around the large training area turned battlefield. Why many of them were interested in getting into a fight of this magnitude he didn't understand. They weren't in Konoha proper, so it wasn't like it affected them directly right now. Of course it was a bit of a blow to his pride every time he saw one of the clans that were previously from Water Country attempt to engage him, though none of them lasted more than a few minutes at best. The ones that gave him the most trouble were the Kaguya. It was truly sad that they moved to Konoha, now he'd have to wipe them out completely when he was done here. Other than a small handful of their clan, the Sandaime Hokage was still standing, though he had no idea where the brat's teammates were. Well, perhaps Hiruzen wasn't so much of a brat anymore, considering the man looked older than he currently did. He was only a little roughed up and didn't really look to be in bad condition, unlike most of his other forces. Even his own students, the Densetsu no Sannin, had taken a beating. Well, more like the idiot with the white hair did. Their medic was currently attending to him, while the pale one was giving him a calculating stare. No matter. Is this the best you and your village have to offer, Hiruzen? He mocked. We're stronger than you know, Madara. I have it on good authority that we're about to get stronger still. Spouting nonsense again? Will this be another of your Will of Fire speeches? If so, spare me. Hiruzen said nothing, but instead crossed his arms over his chest and smirked slightly. Madara narrowed his eyes as he looked at the man. What was he getting so cocky about? His answer arrived a scant few seconds later in the form of 2 golden flashes. He immediately recognized Nagato, and the girl standing to one side of him was the same one who had fled with Naruto before. Speaking of, you just couldn't stay dead, could you, Naruto? The blonde, who had a strange golden aura surrounding him, simply smirked. Missed me, did you? Madara grunted, hoisting his fan up so that part of the staff rested on his shoulder. Not really. Though if I had to be honest, a small part of me was regretting killing you off so early. I'm sure you'd be a better fight than everyone else here. Where is my wife, Madara? The old Uchiha made a show of looking around before shrugging. Oh, somewhere out there among the rest of the trash, I guess. The same for your newest Hokage. The two glowing people in front of him looked to be barely able to contain their anger until the third person rested a hand on each of their shoulders, calming them somewhat. Ah, Nagato. I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. You didn't leave me much of a choice when I found out what kind of peace you were really talking about. Madara rolled his eyes. Yes. Let me guess, here comes another lecture. It's the same one I've been getting from everyone, about how it isn't peace if no one has free will. To me it certainly seems like all their free will is good for is killing each other. I thought you wanted that stopped? Nearly everyone I know does. But it will be pointless if we don't know who we are anymore. Whatever. Does this mean you're going to fight me too? Nagato's reply was only 2 words. He stuck out both of his hands in front of him and in a commanding voice, stated Bancho Tenon. Starting to feel the pull, Madara shifted his posture so that one leg moved forward slightly in a bracing stance, then lifted his free arm and showed his own palm to Nagato, finally opened his long-concealed right eye and repeated the phrase. Several seconds of shocked silence followed. Madara took a quick glance around, noticing that only Naruto didn't seem surprised at this event. For some reason he found himself gritting his teeth in frustration. Did nothing surprise the brat? Putting it out of his mind for the moment, he focused in on Nagato once again. I gave you my own original eyes. I thought you'd enjoy the present, not try to use them against me. It really is no matter, though, since I know their every weakness anyway. A few moments earlier. I was afraid of this. Are the two of you ready? Yes, came Kurama's gruff reply in his mind. Surprisingly, when Naruto had been revived, they discovered that they could both speak clearly through their linked seals. Apparently all it took was forcing both of their current chakras into Naruto's seal, something they hadn't even thought about attempting to try. Remember, we've only managed to fill you up with enough of my chakra to last maybe 5 minutes at most. I can support Kushina indefinitely so long as she doesn't go around wasting shadow clones and menacing balls like you used to, but if I have to start feeding you chakra as well, I'm going to get drained fast. Understood? Kushina? Yes? If you find an opening, take him out. Otherwise we just need to find a way to pin him or keep him occupied so Nagato can work his magic. Got it. Nagato? The blonde saw the redhead turn to look at him out of his peripheral vision. What is it? If you find an opening, take it. I think our best chance would be for you to use the human path. You can use it as you are now, right? Yes. Nagato's response came out more like a question than a confirmation. Naruto understood why when he was asked another question, you've seen all of what I can do? Naruto shrugged, but still not looking away from Madara. Most of it, probably. But at least this time you aren't using 6 bodies by having chakra transmission rods sticking out of your back. There was a momentary pause before his new friend simply said, "Oh." Naruto clone POV. One of many clones was quickly moving through both rubble and moaning bodies, looking for someone. Someone very important to him. The clone desperately wanted to stop and help many of the people that were obviously injured, some of which were mewling for anyone to help them. It would have made more copies of itself to try and help ease the pain in any way possible were it not for strict orders. Keeping an ear and eye out for trouble and making sure the fight wasn't coming back this way. Once the clone finally laid its eyes on the subject of its search, anything and everything else became unimportant. Mikoto was laying there, her back against a tree that had collapsed behind her. His wife's head was drooped down to her chest while her arms were splayed out from her sides as if she had simply been a puppet whose strings were cut. Quickly making its way over, the first thing the clone did was lift her head slightly and touch her neck, feeling for a pulse. It wasn't long before one was found, allowing it a deep sigh of relief. All things considered, other than some tears to her Jonin uniform and some superficial cuts on her face and arms, she didn't really look all that worse for wear. Utilizing a diagnostic technique that he had learned forever ago courtesy of Sakura in Naruto's original timeline, the clone checked over his wife to see if she was badly injured. To the clone's pleasant surprise, however, it couldn't detect anything wrong with her other than a mild case of chakra depletion. In its limited capacity for self-thought, the clone wasn't really able to consider what Mikoto's current cause of unconsciousness was, but it had one more order left to follow. Since she wasn't awake, the task only became a little more complex, but it still could be done. The clone simply hoped that it had enough chakra left to complete its job. Gently cupping Makoto's face in its hands, the clone pressed its lips to hers, starting an information transfer process through chakra that Naruto had discovered during the Fourth War, one which technically only needed basic skin-to-skin contact. However, no one else was around or coherent enough to pay attention to the current goings-on. And, well, she was Naruto's wife after all. After a few seconds, the clone began to fade and become almost transparent before it disappeared with a small popping noise and no smoke, unlike it normally would. Among the sounds of rustling leaves and a fight still going on in the distance, Uchiha Makoto gasped and woke. Battlefield. Madara grunted as he blocked a punch from the glowing girl, only to have to duck another swing from Naruto that likely would have taken his head off if he wasn't careful. His Rinnegan was active in both eyes now, which was both fortunate and unfortunate at the same time. On the negative side, it kept him from using all of his Sharingan techniques unless he felt like parting with more chakra than was safe at this point. Worst of all was Susanoo, since it used too much chakra even with the Sharingan active, and even though his own reserves were incredible, they were not limitless. He might have been able to take on and make short work of everyone here with it, but he wasn't willing to chance it since he had no idea what kind of technique Naruto and the other girl were using right now. Oh, he knew that the girl was in Uzumaki and was the Jinchuriki for the Kyuubi, and his original thought was that he'd simply suppress it with his own Sharingan and his implanted DNA from Senju Hashirama. He only paused with his attempt because Naruto was able to do the same thing, and there was no possible way that both of them had the Kyuubi sealed inside them. The very thought was ludicrous. It made him wonder if they were in fact not using Kyuubi at all, but doing something he had never seen before. So using the Rinnegan was his best course of action right now, since it opened up a few more techniques that he could use, not to mention it would all but make him immune to his own eyes, which the traitor Nagato currently held. Such a disappointment, even if it was an oversight on his part. How was he supposed to know that the few scattered Uzumaki in the elemental nations actually kept in touch with each other? He'd never seen any evidence of it before, not even when he visited Nagato a few years ago. He was forced to bite back a curse as the Yondaime Hokage joined into the battle as well. Apparently he had sufficiently recovered from getting smacked around by the battle fan and was now currently flashing in and out of the fight, attacking any openings he could find when Naruto or the girl left one. Madara knew he couldn't keep going on like this forever, and he couldn't phase out either, since that was a Sharingan technique and currently locked away because of exorbitant chakra cost with his Rinnegan active. Finding an opening was proving nearly useless as well, with three speedy opponents constantly flashing around him. To hell with this. Shinra Tensei. The three of them were immediately thrown backwards, away from him. Taking the small reprieve to gain stock of his surroundings, he wasn't given much of an opportunity as he registered the same voice calling out the names of two different techniques. One wind, one fire. Quickly turning, he noticed as the Sandaime Hokage used a combination technique with a shadow clone to send a quickly moving column of fire at him. Smirking slightly, he simply held out his hand as the column of fire hit him. Hashirama's old student stared at Madara in shock as the technique simply evaporated around him. Thanks for the recharge. Here's a present of my own in return. Mokuton, Sashiki. The look of surprise quickly switched to a grimace as the Sandaime brought his adamantine staff to bear, smashing the blade-shaped pieces of wood that got close to him. Knowing that things could potentially get dicey if he had to handle any more than he was dealing with now, Madara brought his hands together for another technique while ducking an attack from Naruto, who had recovered more quickly than he expected. Mokuton, Jukai Hiki. A series of thick and quick-growing branches began to sprout from the ground between him and the Sandaime and continued spreading in a semicircle. They kept growing bigger and more interlocking until nothing was visible on the other side, and it effectively cut his current attackers off from more than half of the battlefield and any support. It wouldn't last long as he could already hear the sounds of snapping wood, but it shouldn't be beneath his abilities to handle these three upstarts before anyone broke through. Rasengan. While his mouth snapped shut as he whirled around to face the latest attack, a giant ball of spinning chakra being held between the girl and the Yondaime, who were both running at him with surprising speed. As he prepared to absorb the massive chakra, however, it shrunk in size slightly as the Yondaime flashed over to him with a kunai in each hand. Shifting quickly, the Uchiha grunted as one of the kunai caught him in the thigh, even though he managed to block the other one with his fan. To his benefit, the Yondaime Hokage looked both surprised and pleased that he had managed to succeed, but his moment of victory was his own undoing as the handle of Madara's fan swung around and caught him in the gut. With a noof sound, the blonde went flying once again. His action must have further enraged the Jinchuriki as she continued moving forward with the large Rasengan. Ignoring the pain of the kunai still stuck in his leg, he shifted to the side and absorbed what he could from the technique as it narrowly grazed him. The poor girl, however, overextended slightly with the attack. She attempted to recover, but Madara spun around with his good leg and kicked her in the back, sending her flying away with a scream. He watched dispassionately as she crashed into the ground nearby, her golden cloak flickering for a few moments as she struggled to climb back to her feet. That's when he finally noticed a loud screeching noise coming from behind him. Turning around quickly once again and preparing to defend against an attack from Naruto, he was instead mildly surprised to see the thorn in his side simply standing there. The other blonde was no longer glowing with the golden chakra cloak like before, and he idly wondered if his attack connecting with the Jinchuriki girl had anything to do with it. Madara did notice, however, that the young man in front of him appeared to have some sort of orange pigmentation around his eyes. Not only that, but he felt different. It was hard to describe other than the fact that he had a much harder time sensing the boy, even if he was completely visible. Madara's eyes narrowed. This was new. So was this attack, though it looked to be some variation of what the other two had done before. The Rasengan. Fool. You know I can absorb any chakra. Much to his displeasure, Naruto simply shrugged and smirked at him. Perhaps. But even Nagato learned he couldn't absorb this technique. With a shout of Futen, Rasen Shuriken, the blonde hurled the spinning mass of chakra at him. Madara stared at it in momentary shock, wondering how Naruto managed to keep such dense chakra from dispersing. Quickly regaining his bearings, he started to move his hand forward to absorb it. Then it expanded. Madara had seen a lot in his long life. While the Sharingan was a good tool for identifying and copying techniques even without needing to understand the intricacies of them, the Rinnegan was the ultimate at dissection, for lack of a better word. While he couldn't simply copy and reuse a technique like he could with the Sharingan, the Rinnegan would show him exactly what a technique did. He definitely did not like what he was seeing. Sadly, he didn't really have much time to inspect it as it was rapidly expanding further as it bore down on him. But with the exception of the menacing ball, he had never seen such pure destruction put into such a little package before. There was no way he'd be able to absorb it all in time. He prepared to absorb what he could as he brought his fan around to block it. Just in time too, as the outer edge of the technique started to press against it. If he learned one thing from this fight, it was that the Rasen Shuriken certainly took its time to do its thorough job. Madara was grunting with effort as he tried to keep his battle fan in front of him as it blocked the worst of the destruction. He used the pre-top path ability of his eyes to absorb what he could of the chakra that still assaulted him from the sides. He knew he wasn't able to get it all as random sharp stabbing pains began to affect him all over from the microscopic wind blades that he couldn't stop. After what felt like an eternity, the Uchiha breathed deeply as he tried to ignore the phantom pains all over his body. His chakra flow was still fine, so it was likely only superficial damage. Sadly, it looked like he would need a new battle fan, as this one was smoking in places and now had a few holes in it. Madara winced as he shifted his hands on the handle. They hurt a lot more than he wanted, but since he could still feel chakra flowing in them, all was well. There was a rustling noise behind him, and he tried to turn around yet again. Only this time a heavy weight settled on his leg. Looking down, he saw that the Yondaime Hokage had apparently flashed over to him again and was holding the leg so that he couldn't move it, while one hand was on the handle of the kunai that was still stuck there. Of course. Of all the… Madara's thought processes were interrupted as Naruto moved over and quickly grabbed an arm, holding onto it. Not sure what was going on now, Madara attempted to knock Naruto away with his fan, only for the Jinchuriki girl, who was glowing again, to grab that arm and hold it tight. He was effectively pinned, though he didn't really understand the point. Shaking his head and letting out a sigh, the Uchiha closed his eyes. Perhaps it was time for round. What was this? 3. Shinra T. The technique was stopped as something chilling and alien invaded his body from behind, gripping his body in a way that felt both familiar and terrifying. Looking down, he noticed a large chakra construct that was piercing him through the center of his chest. How does it feel? To have a blade in your chest, you monster? Looking over his shoulder, his eyes opened wide as he saw Uchiha Mikoto standing behind him with one of her eyes closed. She was leaning forward and was breathing heavily, with two glowing skeletal arms appearing from her sides. One was holding the blade, that was going through him, while the other was holding a no. It couldn't be. Madara was vaguely aware as his arms and leg were released. Gritting his teeth, he knew that this blade bound his body so that he couldn't move. However, it was his blade before, so he knew of a way to fight it, but it would take all of his concentration. Nagato, your turn. While he was already chilled from having the blade thrust through him, a feeling of dread in his stomach began to solidify as Nagato moved around from his other side. He was vaguely aware as others began approaching as well. Apparently they had either finally broken through the branches or the Rasen Shuriken had enough range to destroy them. He didn't want to admit it, but deep down he knew there was no way he'd be able to win this particular battle. His own arrogance had cost him, but he could learn from this experience. There were a few ideas as to how he could come back, since he knew how to get around the blade eventually, but it would take time. He would have broken free now, but with Nagato here that plan wouldn't work since the redhead could keep Madara's soul with his body to make sure it was all sealed. He couldn't keep a small smirk off his face now. Well, Naruto. It seems as you win this round. Naruto eyed Madara critically. This round? I have no idea what you're talking about. The old Uchiha shook his head. I used to own this blade. I have no idea how you acquired it, but if I'm going to be sealed then you should know I can get out of it. Time is all I need, and I have plenty of it. I'll be back. The ball of dread in Madara's gut only grew more pronounced as Naruto smiled at him. You technically died once, remember? It's how Nagato brought you back in a new body. I'm sure you recall how the blade ended up with you. Of course. It passed down to me when the previous head died. It was almost comical the way a light seemed to go off in Madara's head as understanding immediately appeared in his unique eyes. I see. I seem to have overlooked quite a lot in my quest. Rest assured it won't happen again. You're right, it won't. Naruto's smile turned feral. You know how the sword of Totsuka works, as you said. It can seal anything it wants to. That means if it only wants to seal away your body, it will only seal away your body. Madara's eyes went white again as the implications set in. It seems as though you understand. Nagato will be handling your soul. As if that line was the cue, Nagato's hands stretched forward and everyone watched as Madara appeared to lurch and blur for a moment. The man screamed for a few seconds before there was almost complete silence. With a swishing noise, Madara's physical body began to bend and shift in ways that weren't possible before it collapsed in on itself into the sword, leaving only a transparent wraith-like figure behind. Mikoto pulled the sword out of the soul, sheathing it in the jar in Susanoo's other skeletal hand before nearly collapsing forward from exhaustion. Both Naruto and Kushina quickly moved forward to grab her arms, keeping the woman steady as they let her settle down to the ground. Meanwhile, Nagato stared blankly at the soul for a moment before moving it a little to his right, where to those who couldn't see the king of hell. It simply disappeared. Looking around, he noticed both Hokages staring at him. It's done. He's gone. Both of them looked immensely relieved, then moved over to where Naruto and Kushina were crouched down next to Mikoto, speaking with her quietly. Minato crouched down in front of her, while the Sandaime stood close by. I'm so glad to see you're okay. Both of you. Minato smiled at both his friend/alternate son and his old teammate, both of whom offered a tired smile in return. Looking at Naruto's body with a sword stuck in it was bad enough. Seeing you crash into that tree, I thought you were killed in front of me. Mikoto sighed and nodded. I saw Naruto killed in front of me, so I know what that feels like. As for me, I actually did die. Or I would have. But there is another technique I could use at the cost of one of my eyes called Izanagi. Don't ask me how I learned about it, because I couldn't tell you. It's almost like I just knew what it was and how to use it right as I was about to die. An uncomfortable silence settled on the group momentarily. Is that why? Kushina broke the quiet and looked curious about something, but her voice trailed off. When Mikoto noticed where her best friend's eyes seemed to linger but not directly stare, it wasn't hard to pick up on the unasked question. Yes, that's why my eye is closed. I can't open it at all. I lifted it with my finger before I got here to check, but I couldn't see anything. Total darkness. What about your other eye? I understand you were using quite a few techniques. Naruto inquired, frowning slightly as he recalled his knowledge of the Mangekyo. Mikoto looked up at her husband affectionately, bringing one hand towards his face to gently brush it across his cheek. You're a bit blurry, but I can still tell that you're the man I fell for. Naruto smiled at her, placing his hand lightly on top of hers. You know, we still have your father's eyes that he gave me. Do you want them? His wife actually looked surprised for a moment, as if she completely forgot about it, before adopting a more pensive expression. I don't know. I'm not sure if I should. Can I think about it some, or would you not like it if I was like this? Naruto didn't even have to consider it for a second. I'm perfectly fine with whatever you choose. Honestly though? Having an eye patch over one eye with a bright red Sharingan in the other? If that's not downright sexy and exotic, I don't know what is. Mild laughter came from the other three listening in as Makoto's hand went around the back of Naruto's neck and she pulled him in for a kiss. As it continued, Minato and Kushina both looked away, while the Sandaime felt compelled to clear his throat to get their attention. As much as I hate to break this up, he said with a cheeky smile, causing the two to blush, I need to know for certain that Madara really is gone. We don't need him creeping back up when we least expect it. Both Makoto and Naruto nodded at the same time, though it was Makoto who spoke. You saw that I stabbed him with the sword of Totsuka. It essentially can bind anything at all forever, or until I or the next holder releases it. It's a legendary item among my clan that is passed down to the current head of the clan when the previous one dies. My father never got it, and neither did the head before him, so we thought it was lost. When Makoto stopped talking and looked expectantly at her husband, he took it as the cue to continue. When one of my clones found Makoto, it made sure she was okay, and if she was, its next job was to remind her of the sword. Upon talking with Nagato, before heading into the fight, I was reminded of a brief conversation I had in my time about the sword with the person who had inherited it. Makoto would have had it for nearly 2 years, but as she didn't have the Mangekyo yet there was no way for her to check. The blonde graced his wife with a brief smile, which she returned before he finished talking to the Sandaime. I'm glad she was able to use it, because if she wasn't our job was still possible with Nagato's help. It would have involved wearing Madara down enough to the point where he wouldn't be able to protect himself from Nagato's soul capture technique, and I'm not sure how many we might have lost had it gone that way. Believe me, compared to the hell I came from, this was a much better alternative. When Naruto finished talking, it was as if a huge weight had been lifted from Hiruzen's shoulders. The man sighed in relief before rubbing his forehead. So he really is gone, then. There was a chorus of affirmatives, and with a thankful smile and a nod, the Sandaime wandered off to tell the others the news. After the silence among them stretched out for a few comfortable moments, Minato chuckled, causing all attention to focus on him. So. Since that's done and the third war is over. What do we do now? Now? Naruto grinned. I'm up for a festival. How about you guys? There was another chorus of agreements before Minato and Kushina both excused themselves to go talk to the Sandaime about it right away. When they had wandered far enough away, he heard Makoto murmur his name. Looking down at her, he paused for a moment upon seeing the slight frown on her face. What's wrong? I should be asking you that. Her hand rose once again, brushing across his cheek. She turned her fingers around to show him that they were wet. Why are you crying, Naruto? The fact that he had tears running down his face surprised him, but he confirmed it by wiping his other cheek and looking at his hand. I don't know. I guess I just feel so much relief that it's finally over and I'm, well, free? I don't have a madman to deal with anymore. We're all free, thanks to your efforts. I'm glad we were all able to help even a little along the way. Nodding in acceptance, but not saying anything further, he settled down on the ground next to his wife, grabbing her hand and holding it in his as she rested her head against his shoulder. I love you, Makoto. I love you too. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. Epilogue. As is the situation on most days, I have no idea why I woke up when I did. My blanket was warm, and I was in a very comfortable position, prompting thoughts as to why, for the life of me, I could not fall back into the blissful oblivion of sleep. Then again, I realized it should not have come as much of a surprise, as I'd gotten quite used to only needing 4 or 5 hours of sleep in order to regain full functionality. Honestly, I usually didn't even need that much. Finally yawning and deciding that, no matter how much I desired it, I wasn't going to fall back asleep, if only because my body was wired that way. Sitting up with a groan, I stretched and prepared for my normal morning routine. Only to stop short when I realized that I wasn't in my room. Well, technically it was my room. I simply didn't have much use for it anymore. One of the perks of my job was that I got a fully furnished apartment on the premises, and a large majority of the time I just used that. It's what it was there for, after all. After waking up the rest of the way and going through the motions of the morning routine, the first place I headed was the kitchen. Softly padding down the hallways and entering the bright room, a small smile settled on my face as my eyes landed upon the only other person in the room. Considering I hadn't seen or heard anyone else yet, it was likely she was the only other one here. Everyone else had their own things to deal with, after all. "Good morning, Orihime-san." The long-tenured family maid turned her head slightly to look over her shoulder, offering me a small smile before she turned back to her task. "Good morning. You were just going to bed when I got here. I'll never understand how you shinobi function on so little sleep." I couldn't stop a chuckle from leaving my lips. I remember a lesson from Sanada-sama long ago, something about shinobi having an enhanced metabolism due to our active chakra systems. Orihime hummed for a moment before nodding. Well, that would explain some things. I could hear her murmur something more, but decided against paying attention. The smell of food was becoming overpowering, and my stomach chose to announce its displeasure at still being empty. My, always so demanding. Who, me or my stomach? Orihime turned from the counter with a nicely prepared meal as she walked over to me. She always enjoyed teasing me, and this moment didn't seem like it would be any different. Well, usually both. But your stomach is definitely much easier to please. I was preparing a meal, thinking you would be waking up until later to eat it. I was just getting ready to wrap it up. You have impeccable timing. I hummed and started digging into my food as soon as it was placed in front of me. Delicious as always. Looking up, I noticed that Orihime was taking off her apron, which she never did unless she was leaving. Well-ingrained manners made certain that I quickly chewed and swallowed before posing the ultimate question. "Where are you going?" Orihime offered a faint smile as she grabbed her work bag and headed towards the front door. "I promised to meet Gendo-kun at the academy. They have half lessons today because of the upper years' graduation testing, remember?" My eyes widened as my brain finally decided to kick into gear. It would have come back to me as the day went on. I was well known for being a bit of an airhead for up to an hour after I woke up. "Thanks for the reminder. Tell the brat I said hello." Orihime's tinkling laugh came from the entryway. "I will. Can I trust you to clean up after yourself?" "I guess. I'm not a kid anymore, you know." "Really? You could have fooled me." I heard the front door open. "Have a good day." The door closed, and I grumbled to myself as I returned to consuming my morning meal. I loved Orihime dearly, and to be honest, she was one of maybe 5 people anywhere in the elemental nations that I would allow to get away with calling me names. She knew it too, though to her credit she only acted that way when we were alone or around our respective families. As I turned back to my food, my eyes happened to scan over the counter where she had been standing. I noticed that, while all the food had been put away, there were still dishes to clean. Damn it. I hated doing the dishes. Some time later. Today was technically supposed to be my one day of the week off barring any unforeseen emergencies, so I took full advantage of that fact. Dressed in my usual Jonin attire, complete with orange open fingertip gloves and both Uchiha and Uzumaki crests embroidered onto the collar of my flak vest. Making my way slowly around the former Uchiha district, I offered greetings and was given many in return as I moved from stall to stall, checking for any interesting items one of the vendors may have had. None of them seemed to have changed much inventory since I was last through here about a month ago, but I'm not sure what I was expected. While aimlessly wandering around the village was not something I was responsible for, most of the people I talked to appeared to appreciate my visits. Moving back to one of the main paths and looking around once again, I couldn't help but marvel at how quickly things were capable of changing. What had once been a primarily residential district had managed to transform into a large trade bazaar that always had something exciting going on. The Uchiha clan was still headquartered here, of course, as was my permanent home, even if I used my apartment more often than not. Hiding a yawn behind my hand, I gradually made my way out of the bazaar and onto the main concourse, idly watching as carts drawn by all manner of creatures from horses to mules to even the people themselves as they went by. Some recognized me and offered greetings, which I felt compelled to return. I had a destination in mind, thinking that I hadn't seen the people that resided there in a while. Well, it had been maybe 3 days, but in my line of work it felt like forever. Hopping up to the rooftops, a few quick jumps had my target in sight, and it was barely 30 seconds later that I landed silently outside of a small, well-maintained area. The Uzumaki compound. That was the official title on the books at least. I'd heard the yandere grudgingly refer to it as the hellhole every once in a while. I'm certain it was in a completely affectionate manner. Really. He was usually smiling when he said it. Walking over to one of the larger houses, I knocked on the door, honestly unsure if anyone was home at this hour. Luckily, it didn't take long for me to hear footsteps running up to the door, followed by said door being yanked open and a little missile with red hair jumping right into my gut. "Hikari Onasama." Trying to ease the pain in my abdomen and peeled a little squirt off of me at the same time, I couldn't help but chuckle. "What are you doing home, Chika-chan? I thought you still had school today?" Before the little girl could answer, there was a faint laugh from the doorway. Looking up, I saw one of the women I admired most in the world. After my own mother, of course. Chika was complaining that she wasn't feeling good this morning, and since it was a short day I let her stay home. However, she seems fine now, so perhaps I should oversee her training myself for the rest of the afternoon. Oh, I'm not feeling so good. The spunky redhead collapsed in a controlled manner onto the ground at my feet, moaning piteously. I tried to keep it back, but I'm pretty sure a giggle escaped my lips. "Is there something I can do for you, Hikari-chan? It's nice to see you, as always." I tried to keep my face from twitching, but I'm pretty sure it did since the woman in front of me immediately graced me with one of her knowing smirks. Other than Orihime-san, this lady was one of the others I'd unwillingly allow to treat me like a kid, but get away with it. "Yes, actually. Do you know where Minato Ajisan is, Kushina Abasan?" Kushina actually rolled her eyes and shook her head. "No, sorry. Last he told me he was working on some super secret project with Marino Ibiki and Yamanaka Inoichi. Something to do with the sensory barrier, I'd guess." The older redhead snorted and crossed her arms over her chest. "Men and their toys," she muttered. On one hand, I felt myself agreeing. On the other hand, however, I understood the necessity of the barrier. We kept impeccable records of all people who entered the village both legally and illegally. At least we tried to. No village security system was perfect, no matter how much I'd like to delude myself that ours was. "I see," I said, shrugging. "Well, if you see him, can you let him know that I'm looking for him? It's not that important, but I'd like to pick his brain about a few things." "Certainly, Hikari-chan." I nodded and was about to walk off before her voice stopped me. "By the way, do you know when Jiro-kun might come over to visit again? Naomi misses her best friend." To be honest, I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Jiro was my next youngest sibling, and he was a bit of a hothead. Or at least he used to be. He and Uzumaki Naomi had been virtually inseparable growing up, but something happened a few months ago. They got into some massive fight, and Jiro pretty much turned into a recluse. I was curious, naturally. But I wasn't the type to pry into someone's private business. I don't know if he appreciated that or not, because I very rarely got anything more than one-word answers out of him. Sadly, we were never that close growing up because Naomi pretty much hugged him all to herself, so pulling out the sibling card to help him with his problems was a definite no-go. You know I can't very well order my brother to do something he doesn't want to do, right? I spit that out with a bit more vitriol than I intended and immediately felt guilty when a wince passed across my aunt's face before she looked away. I immediately opened my mouth to apologize, but she beat me to it. "No, I understand. I didn't mean it like that, but she's been inconsolable for a while now, and I have no idea what's wrong." I let out a sigh. "Did you ask her what happened?" I tried. My aunt pushed some loose strands of hair back behind her ear. "She won't answer me. All she does now is go about her business like a drone. Even her usual teammates have visited, asking if I could do something. I'm at my wit's end." I grimaced. "If I talk to her, it won't end well, you know. Even if she is my cousin, we've never really gotten along." Perhaps that was a bit blunt, but it was the truth. I think in every family you're guaranteed to have at least one person you don't like all that much. For my family, that person was Naomi. Not just because she pretty much stole one of my brothers from me, but she also loved being the center of attention. In class when she was in the academy, on her squad, in any bar. She let the fame of her parents get to her a little too much and for all intents and purposes acted like a spoiled little princess. I know for a fact that my aunt didn't raise her like that, and even if Minato Ajisan could go easy on her from time to time, I have no idea where she learned that behavior from. She was so bad at times that even my dad tried to keep her at arm's length. Now that is saying something. Kushina didn't say anything further regarding Naomi, instead letting out a small sigh before clapping her hands. "Come on, Chika. Get up and get inside. You've got some studying to do, or there will be no dessert for you tonight after dinner." The little redhead hopped to her feet faster than I thought possible and without so much as a "by your leave," ran around her mother back into the house. By the way, Kushina began once Chico was back in the house. Nagato returned from Rain Country yesterday. He's visiting with his niece. You know the one, Conan, and Yuhiko's little girl? Of course. I smiled. The girl was adorable and could do amazing things with paper. Since he's back, do you think he'd have some free time to do a little training? My aunt smiled at me. I was once again struck by how pretty she was. For a 40-something, she didn't even really look 30. Uzumaki longevity is amazing. If he wasn't available, I wouldn't have mentioned it. He actually suggested it to me when he got back, but he wants a day to rest first. I waved my hand. No problem. Just tell him to stop by when he has time. I'll make some free time for myself. Certainly. Thanks for stopping by, Hikari-chan. I'll make sure to mention to my husband that you're looking for him. Whenever he decides to stop playing with his toys and come home, anyway. I grinned slightly, secretly relieved that she either forgot to talk more about Naomi or decided to leave the subject be. Either way was fine with me. Waving goodbye, I jumped back up to the rooftops, thinking about what I wanted my next destination to be. Frowning, I quickly realized that I didn't have much to do, short of perhaps going shopping or tagging around with one of my family members. Perhaps a random, surprise visit to one of Konoha's departments? Nah. It's my day off. Sighing internally, I started jumping around from rooftop to rooftop, stretching my senses and looking for familiar signatures. I had the chakra feeling of all my immediate family memorized, so I knew how to pinpoint them exactly should the need ever arise. So far it hadn't, but better safe than sorry. As I neared the edge of the second ring of Konoha, I started picking up one. No. Two traces outside the village in one of the training grounds. As I got closer, I noticed that it was Training Area 16, which was often used by Chunin who were experimenting with new techniques. Imagine my surprise to find Jiru there along with my next youngest sister, Amaya. Jiru was watching her with his Sharingan active, while she appeared to be doing some sort of chakra-related exercise. Her chakra was fluctuating a bit, but it was nothing severe. Both of them looked up when I landed. Jiru's Sharingan immediately faded, returning back to his dark onyx-colored eyes. Amaya, meanwhile, stood up and rushed over to me, giving me a tight hug. "Nissan. It feels like forever since I saw you. Well, you were out on assignment for 3 weeks, and I was busy when you got back. So, in our line of work, it sort of has been forever." She grinned at me, and I looked to see if I could notice any changes. At 16, she was already what I'd consider a knockout beauty, though I like to believe I was no slouch in the looks department either. However, while I took after my father, Amaya more resembled our mother. If I was to be petty and further compare our looks, she had legs I would gladly kill for, though I beat her handily in the bust department. We both kept our hair at about the same length, just above our shoulder blades. However, my hair was a deep golden color just like my father, whereas Amaya had a rather unique very deep red. So deep that it appeared black unless you held it directly under a bright light. The one trait we did share was that we both were born with our father's bright blue eyes, though mine had leaned more towards a greenish blue. Glancing over at my younger brother, I saw him staring dispassionately at us, not moving. "Hey there, Jiru." He simply nodded, followed by a succinct, "Hello." "What, you're not going to come give your big sister a hug?" I rearranged my face into a pout, hoping to tease him a little, but as usual lately he completely ignored it. Snorting, I began arguing with myself about mentioning Naomi, but Amaya posed a question to me that made me temporarily forget about it. "Hikari-Nissan, you know the Rasengan, right?" Raising an eyebrow, I slowly nodded my head. "Yeah. It's something like a rite of passage in our family." That was perhaps stretching the truth a bit, even if from a certain perspective it was true. We weren't forced to do it at any point, but when asked about it, we were all willingly given instructions by the adults. Now it had become something of a new tradition. I knew for a fact that my older brother and Jiru could both do it, and I'd seen my cousin Masahiro do it as well. The only one I didn't know for sure was Naomi. But I didn't really care about her anyway. Among all of my siblings and cousins I did hold a trump card. I was the only one who could successfully complete and use the Rasen Shuriken other than my father. Uncle Minato could make one, but he needed 4 clones to my 2, and he was completely wiped out after making one. "Do you have any tips?" I eyed her hands critically. "Has Jiru suggested anything?" Amaya frowned briefly before fixing into a neutral mask, shaking her head. The frown was quick, but I saw it. He said that he'd let me know if something was wrong, but other than that, nothing. Nodding more to myself than anyone else, I did a hand seal then held it to the inside of my left wrist. A small puff of smoke later, and a small marker appeared in my right hand. Most people thought it was silly of me to seal away writing utensils, but in my line of work I never knew when I'd need to sign something. Reaching out and grabbing Amaya's left hand, I made our leaf symbol in the middle of her palm. A few of the lines were a little squiggly, but I'm sure she understood what it was. As I resealed my marker away, my sister looked curiously at the mark, then back at me, obviously waiting for an explanation. Focus your chakra onto that point. Worry about the power later, right now you just need to be able to focus. When you can feel the chakra in your hand, start spinning it in one direction first, then continue adding directions until you can contain all that spinning chakra into a ball. Add some power to it, and you'll have a Rasengan before you know it. As if to solidify my point, in a little over a second I had lifted my hand and held a perfectly round Rasengan in it. Amaya looked at it, then me, and finally nodded with a smile. Thanks, Nissan. Of course. As Amaya moved towards the shade of some trees to practice for a little while, I slowly walked over to Jiru, who stared at me the entire way. At first I was getting cold feet, but I knew deep down that something needed to be done. I know you likely don't want to hear this, but you need to do something about Naomi. His face immediately darkened, and I believed with that one sentence I effectively burned any amount of sibling sympathy I had from him. Kushina came just short of begging me today. I don't know what it is that's going on between you two, but I for one am tired of it. I miss the brother I almost never had because that girl sunk her fangs into you early, and now you're essentially a recluse. I don't care what you have to do. Short of outright killing or injuring her, anyway. But this shit needs to stop now. Do you understand? I hated to pull the authority card. As limited as it was over family. But I really was tired of this whole situation. I was tempted to bribe some of the mission assignment people to give Naomi some long-term border patrol mission on the ass end of nowhere. I'd even be willing to prostrate myself before my aunt and uncle to beg for forgiveness, believing it was a necessary evil to do so. Jiru had paled as I moved along on my rant before scowling near the end and simply disappearing with a body flicker. I sighed. So much for that. Nissan? Was that really necessary? I couldn't stop my shoulders from shrugging. Perhaps. Perhaps not. At this point I'm about to give up on him and Naomi both. They need a kick in their respective rears. I don't like getting involved in personal affairs like that, but Kushina Abasan asked me to try to do something. So. Okay. Amaya was awesome. She always accepted simple explanations and didn't press for details unless lives depended on it. My parents were both usually the same way. It was amazing when child rearing worked correctly. I was about to ask my sister if she needed any further help with learning the Rasengan, but a flare of chakra from an arriving Anbu operative stopped that. It was a woman with long, flowing purple hair, though she didn't look to be in uniform. I have to admit that I'm biased towards some people if it hasn't been obvious already. Though I believe most others are just like me. Yu Gao is one of my favorite people since she used to babysit me on occasion when I was little, along with the rest of her Genin team. It sucks when everyone grows old and starts doing their own things, though there were a few bonds that I tried desperately to keep from breaking. Yu Gao was one of them. Yu Gao ni, how are you? She graced me with a small smile as she walked closer, offering the same to Amaya, who made a point to go over and hug the other woman. I'm doing well. How are both of you? We both chirped that we were fine. I then simply stared at her with a raised eyebrow, physically asking her what she was doing all the way out here. As brilliant as Yu Gao is, she picked up on it immediately. I met your brother in passing. He asked to meet you at your office when it's convenient. I sighed and rubbed at my forehead. When it's convenient in Itachi speak, was get your ass here now. Yu Gao was the only one who would phrase it so nicely. Did I mention I really liked her? Thanks, Yu Gao ni. Did he volunteer you again? Do I have to kick his ass? The purple-haired woman let out a tinkling laugh, shaking her head. No, it's fine. He's just on baby duty today, or he may have come to get you himself. I was just dropping off some of my own paperwork. It made sense. Yu Gao was in charge of Anbu Division Delta, while Itachi was the Anbu commander, so they were often relaying messages for each other. Now that my job is done, if you'll both excuse me, I need to go get my kids from Anko's before she completely corrupts them. I winced. Between Anko and my uncle Abito, if she wasn't careful her kids would never be the same. Yeah, you'd better hurry. She laughed again before disappearing in a swirl of leaves. Turning back to my sister, I saw that she had plopped down on the ground again and was focusing on the spot I had drawn on her hand. There was chakra pulsing rapidly, so she was well on her way. Do you need anything else, Amaya? She looked up at me. Oh. No. I'm going to work on this a little more before I go home. Will I see you there? I didn't really know. Maybe, if mom and dad get back today, I might stay over for the night. Amaya smiled. It would be nice to have us all at home for a day. It's been a while. Running through my recent memories, I had to agree. I think the last time we were all at home was for my father's birthday, about 7 months ago? True. I'll see if I can make it. Anyway, I'd better go see what Itachi wants now, so I'll see you later. Good luck with your project. Thanks Hikari-Nisan. See you later. Thankfully when I arrived at my office, it looked to be a quiet day in the rest of the building. Stopping by my secretary, she only handed me a few forms, likely the ones Yu-Gao dropped off earlier, and told me that my brother was in fact waiting in my office. Thanking her, I opened the door to my office and entered, looking around the room. I hadn't changed it much from the way my predecessor left it, other than perhaps a few pictures on the wall and on my desk. There really wasn't much to change. Well, there was a playpen in the corner, because for some reason or another a lot of baby monitoring seemed to have happened here. That's what happens when your family controls the office for over 20 years. Hokage-sama. I sighed and counted to 10 in my mind. Aniki, how many times have I told you that you can just use my name when we're like this? Itachi chuckled from where he was sitting at the desk, holding and playing with his son who was already nearing toddlerhood. I couldn't believe how quickly he was growing. Likely over 50 times. Maybe 100. I stopped keeping count, but if I don't act in a professional manner, who knows what kind of precedent that will set for the rest of my people under my charge. I scared as I walked over to them after closing the office door behind me. Even in private? I don't think I'll ever understand you. That's fine. I've never asked you to. I lightly chuckled at his blasé attitude before crouching down in front of his son, who clapped excitedly and mumbled baby talk at me before sticking out his pudgy little hands in my direction. Oh, and how are you my little Sasuke-kun? Did you come to see your Auntie Hikari? He gurgled something before I clearly heard a repeated higgy, and continued holding his hands out. I grabbed the little one and hoisted him up much to his delight, assuming the squeals were any indication. Of course at the same time I was trying to keep myself from melting into a pile of goo and letting out a squeal of my own, hearing the little one attempt to say my name. I was more professional than that. Especially in front of Itachi, as he'd never let me live it down, not to mention that he was in charge of nearly 1/3 of my forces. You know, the ones who were supposed to be under my executive command? I can imagine them snickering from their hiding places now. Trying to regain my composure and ignore Itachi's knowing look, I deliberately changed the subject. So the missus had to work today? I asked. My older brother nodded. Settling Sasuke on my hip and bouncing him a little, I examined Itachi for a moment. He looked more content than I had ever seen him, and that's really saying something. Growing up he confessed to me, when we were both older teens, that he always felt so overshadowed by our parents that they had such monstrous figures to live up to and match. Of course, both of our parents, being who they were, spotted this rather easily. They simply told both of us, as I believe they have since told all of my siblings, that we only have to do what we want to do. There were no expectations. While that eased our minds somewhat, Itachi still wanted to get as far as he could, and I think he even wanted to be Hokage at one point, but that was barred from him thanks mostly to Konoha's charter, which said that an Uchiha could not be Hokage after the whole Madara debacle from long ago. The council at the time had pushed that through back then because all of the clans were rather upset with the Uchiha and no one had really worked to reverse it, though the Nidaime Hokage had given my ancestors the police force as a oops, we're sorry gesture. My brother had settled for Anbu commander before they figured out a little loophole, likely figuring it was the next best thing. He chose to maintain his course. Needless to say he's the youngest one, ever. As for me? Well, I was the best pick for Hokage after the Yondaime stepped down for multiple reasons. Even though I was born an Uchiha, I lucked out because my father is in Uzumaki. That little loophole from before? Yeah, Thanks to a trick of paperwork and the way my parents' marriage contract was worded, for the duration of my tenure as Hokage I'm technically Uzumaki Hikari. There wasn't a single complaint then, and still hasn't been one almost a year later, so I'd venture a guess that I'm not doing too shabby. In my heart, though, I'm pure Uchiha. Don't get me wrong, I adore my Uzumaki heritage. I just wasn't raised understanding the history and the way of life of the Uzumaki clan, but rather the Uchiha one. Dad told me bits and pieces, but I honestly don't think he even knew much about his old family, since he and his sister were orphans. He claimed that she knew a lot more, as she was the history buff between them, but I never bothered to ask. I handed Sasuke back to my brother as I moved around my desk. Thankfully it was still clean and neither of my assistants had decided to junk it up. I had to admit that they were rather competent, so it wasn't much of a surprise. Sitting down, I smiled to myself as I heard Sasuke giggling with his father. I looked at my older brother again. He was, for all intents and purposes, a perfect copy of our mother, just obviously with more masculine features. It was fairly amusing to both my parents then, when I ended up being a perfect copy of my father, whisker marks on my cheeks and all while. You guessed it. Having more feminine features. Though to be fair, all of my siblings had the whisker marks, minus Itachi. As for the reason why, it's all gibberish about seals that I don't really know that well, but it has something to do with the old fuzzbit, Kyuubi. Though I hated when he performed that sexy technique of his. Oh. It made me so mad to think of that completely perfect figure. Of course, my mother would be the only woman in the village who would laugh along with my father when he did that. I bet every other mother would be absolutely scandalized. Thankfully he didn't scar my mind with it until I was well into my teen years. But. Wait, wow. I've started digressing all over the place. So what did you need to see me about, Aniki? Itachi looked at me before his gaze shifted back to his son, who was now trying to eat his own hand, apparently. Two things. Father sent a clone here earlier today, but since you weren't in it came to me before dispelling. They're returning from Kiri and should be here this evening. I raised an eyebrow. Did they say how things went with Yugura? Not too much, other than it was successful. Somehow they talked him into coming to visit Konoha, something about the Sanbi and Kyuubi catching up on old times. Do I need to prepare for a diplomatic visit? Itachi shook his head, though still watching Sasuke as he bounced the giggling boy on his knee. No, it will be purely informal from what he says. Besides, you have enough on your plate with the Tsuchikage coming to visit in a few days. That was true. Though I think Kuretsuchi was just using this string of diplomatic visits to get away from the stuffy old men she was waiting to die off on her advisory council, relics left over from before her grandfather passed on. Her dad didn't want the spot, so she was literally handed the Tsuchikage position on a platter. I thought it was fairly amusing how she was even a year younger than I was. Perhaps she was just coming to me for advice? Like I'm some sort of bastion of Kage advice. Nah. We end up drinking the nights away, usually. What was the other thing? Itachi paused for a moment, as if steeling himself. He'd even stopped bouncing Sasuke, who was looking about randomly, as if wondering why the bouncing stopped. Jiru applied for Anba yesterday. I just found out from Rin-ni this morning. I'm guessing he thought she wouldn't come directly to me with it. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossing over my chest. Well, this was interesting. Rin was in charge of Beta Division, and while we were acquaintances, I wasn't nearly as close with her as I was with Yugao. Still, Jiru had to know that Itachi would have seen the application eventually, and then me. Do you know what's up with him and Aomi, by the way? Do you think that had something to do with his application? Perhaps. Itachi's voice trailed off, obviously thinking about it. Some Anbu assignments have been known to last for months, perhaps he feels the urge to just get away for a while. I sighed and rubbed at my forehead. I could already feel a headache coming on, and today was supposed to be my day off, damn it. I already talked to him this morning about the whole Naomi thing. Before that I've already mentioned to him about becoming a jonin. I mean he's 20 years old now and more than capable of taking up the new rank. He's already been sitting at special jonin for 3 years. As much as I don't want to say it, I think following Naomi around has messed him up. Itachi simply nodded, not denying a word. I knew that he didn't particularly care for Naomi either. No one in my family did that I knew of, but Itachi was the most patient with her. Whenever I asked him why he had such patience for her, he would just ruffle my hair in an affectionate manner then state that he had practice from dealing with me. Of course I'd be mad at him for all of 5 seconds before realizing he was probably right. I was a bit of a brat until I graduated the academy. I had even adopted my father's mannerisms when he was young, or so he claimed. I was such. No, I still am such a daddy's girl. My mother used to joke that she'd have to watch out for when I got older or I'd steal my dad away from her. I was perfectly willing to do just that until I started entering my later teens, but I'm mature enough now to admit that I used to have a serious crush on him, as odd as that may sound. I take solace in the fact now that I'm likely closer to him than any other women in the world, barring his sister and my mother. I'm comfortable with that. Bringing my thoughts back to the matter at hand, I said, tell him I said no until he becomes Jonan and can have a mature conversation with me that consists of more than 2 words. Until then, Anbu is barred to him. If he needs an assignment to get away for a bit, I'll see if I can find one for him, if he can ask me personally for it without being a baby. Itachi actually winced. Isn't it a bit harsh? I shrugged. Honestly, I was just tired of the whole situation. Maybe, but give me some credit, Aniki. We're a family of shinobi. So are the Uzumaki. I know that Minato Ajusan used to cater to Naomi a little too much, but I can cut him some slack since she was his firstborn daughter. Okay, I get that. But I'm not the Yondaime Hokage, and I won't tolerate either of our families not acting like what we were born to be. I have no idea where that speech came from. But I thought it sounded pretty cool. Itachi must have thought so too, because his face showed surprise for a moment before it morphed into a grin, and he made a show of wiping a fake tear from his eye. Look at Miyamoto, all grown up. It makes a grown man cry. I growled at him, tempted to throw a paperweight at his head, but he was still holding Sasuke. As if sensing my desire and subsequent predicament, the little squirt gurgled out a laugh. Or maybe he was laughing at me too. Down, Hikari. Don't think about throwing things at babies. You like babies. A knock at the door caused me to frown. I wasn't supposed to even be here today, and everyone in the village knew I was off, so who the hell? Sighing again and sending a glare at the amused look Itachi gave me, I shouted for whoever it was to enter. Hokage-sama. How are you? I groaned internally. That was Uzumaki Masahiro. He was equal parts crazy and scary smart. In a strange sense he was almost like a perfect mix between my father and his own mother, Kushina. Uncle Minato had jokingly washed his hands of Masahiro, suggesting that he was a little too intimidated to try to handle a male version of his wife. Rumor was that he spent a week on the couch for that joke. I'm fine, Masahiro-kun. How are you? Great. In a creepy way, the beaming smile he was giving me reminded me of my father. Honestly, we all noticed that he looked exactly like my dad, the only difference was that he had red hair like both of his other siblings and not blonde. It was something of a running joke, though as we got older, Itachi and I both noticed that whenever the subject came up, that the 4 parents all had these knowing looks, like they were all privy to some inside joke that us kids wouldn't understand. When we asked, they either brushed it off or tried to joke about how it would be interesting to have a non-redhead Uzumaki for the first time in who knows how long. Of course with me that joke fell a little flat, because I was the first blonde Uchiha born in about 60 years, according to the clan record. Hey, Hikari-onisan? Can I pick up one of the graduating squads and become a sensei? My mind came to a jarring halt. I must have sat there and stared blinking at him for a few moments. Stopping yet another sigh and internally scowling at another amused look Itachi was sending my way, I simply asked why. Well, Itsuko-chan and Isamu-kun are both graduating today, right? I sort of promised them, when we were all younger, that I'd be their sensei someday. Huh. I didn't know he'd said that to my youngest twin siblings. Learn something new every day. You're just now deciding to bring this to my attention today? On the day they graduate? Masahiro winced a little, and his smile faltered. It was only then that I noticed he entered with someone else. None other than one of my assistants, Hyuga Hinata. Masahiro tended to have that blinding effect, bringing all the attention to himself and making everyone else around him sort of invisible. That was interesting. Maybe there was some fact to the rumors that the Hyuga planned on asking about marrying the 2 of them. Being my assistant, I saw Hinata quite often and easily noticed the doe eyes she would send towards my cousin. Awkwardly, Masahiro used to look at me the same way. Yeah, I was aware of it, but he never said anything, and there was no way in hell I was getting with a cousin that was just like my dad. I'd rather have the real thing, not the copy. I can't believe I just thought that. I need to wash my mind out with bleach. Look, Masahiro-kun, First you need to be a full Jonin, not just a special Jonin. Go take your test when it's available next month, and I'll see about you getting a part-time apprenticeship with them if both they and their assigned sensei agree. But the teams were already picked about a month ago. He looked a little disappointed at first, but as I gradually explained, his face returned to the beaming smile. Thanks, Hikari-Anasan. I'll get right on it. Without another word, he immediately turned around and ran out the door. I couldn't stop a small fond smile that worked its way onto my face. Unlike the way my younger brother had been acting recently, Masahiro was still bustling with energy and willing to work to prove himself. I idly nodded my head as Hinata made a small bow and quickly turned and ran as well, following after Masahiro. I admit to liking her, she's a competent worker, and while perhaps a little on the shy side, she has an undeniable subtle, steely grace that was perfect for political work. Itachi cleared his throat, making me focus on him again. Well, I think that's all, Hokage-sama. If you'll excuse me, I need to get this one home to take a nap. Looking at Sasuke, I could see that he was leaning back against his father's chest now, eyes drooping a little. If he was anything like his father, he was an early riser, and being as young as he was, it made sense that he'd be tired. All right. Will you be coming back home tonight if mom and dad make it today? He shrugged as he rose, then turned the question back on me. Will you? Okay, so perhaps I was a little notorious for not being home since becoming the Godame. But could you blame me? It was a lot of work. I promised Amaya that I would, so yes. He nodded. I'll be there. If Sasuke's awake and my wife is home, I'll bring them too. I graced them both with a small smile, though it looked like the little one had already drooped off to sleep. See you then. The rest of the day, thank the gods, was dead quiet. After catching a nap in my office, don't tell anyone, I stopped by my father's favorite place to eat. Ichiraku ramen. I wasn't as big a fan of the stuff as he was, but I had to admit, their ramen was to die for. Not only that, but Ayama was pretty fun to gossip with, and her little boy was quite the charmer as well. Of course, I just seem to have a thing for babies anyway. Not that I'd ever tell anyone that. Sure, I want one or two of my own someday, but not for a good few years yet. I had to find a man that I didn't completely intimidate with my eyes or my position first, and that I wasn't related to. Sadly, that made the dating market rather small. I sat up straighter at the ramen stall when a very familiar sensation brushed against the limits of my sensory capabilities. It was still a fair distance off, so I had some time yet. Still, paying my bill and quickly excusing myself, I hopped back to my office and grabbed my robe and hat. Walking down the main concourse towards the outer south gate, I returned the greetings of everyone that was willing to offer one. Of course, everyone was willing to say hello to the Hokage, so believe it or not, I had to be careful where I walked in my garb for fear of losing my voice of all things. The population of Konoha had burgeoned in recent years, what with the addition of nearly a dozen new clans in the last 25 years, 2 full-walled expansions, plus all the extra needs a village of that size entailed. The workload of the position of Hokage had evened out a little bit, there was a lot more to do with the military, research, and security departments, but actual governing responsibilities had been shifted over to a new installed governor from the daimyo's court about 7 or 8 years ago. It was unprecedented at the time, and Konoha was really considered a fully fledged city now, but the population was becoming a bit too much for our simple clan-based government to run. Oh, the clan council still existed. Itachi had been the Uchiha head for about 3 years now. After mom retired, he'd often tell me all about the meetings, though they reported to the governor's office now. I was friendly enough with the governor, though we usually minded our own business where our jobs were concerned. Mostly because I couldn't stand stuck-up court politicians and would sooner beat them into a bloody paste than deal with their political gimmicks, and the governor couldn't tell a kunai from a butter knife. As I stood at the outer south gate and watched the sun start to set behind the trees, I began to wonder what the Konoha of my parents had looked like before the way it became the way it was today. Certainly there were pictures, but not as many as you'd think. Of course, some of the more interesting ones were of when my parents were dating, and I always enjoyed looking at the before and afters of the Hokage monument. Maybe I'm a little bit biased in that regard, considering my face is on it now. I straightened up a little as I saw several figures approaching in the distance. To be honest, I was a little nervous about meeting the Mizukage, Yugura, even if he wasn't here on official business. But he was the only Kage that I hadn't met personally yet during the almost year of me being Hokage. It wasn't for lack of trying, But they had the Chunin exams in Kiri about 2 months after my coronation, and I wasn't realistically prepared to travel. We were having them in Iowa next month, so I would have met him then anyway, if not now. As they got closer, I could make out several other figures who were probably the Mizukage escort. There were 3 of them, and as they approached it was pitifully easy to recognize who they were. Hoshigaki Kasama, Mamachi's Abuza, and Hazuki Mangetsu. All from clans that did not leave Kiri to come to Konoha, and all 3 were rather notorious members of the Kiri no Shinobigatana Shichinen Shu. Itachi was going to be grumbling about the security detail needed for these guys. As they all approached, I first reached a hand out for Yugura, who for someone of his relatively short stature had a surprisingly strong grip. Seriously, I was of about average height, but he was easily 2 to 3 inches shorter than I was. Poor guy. However, with his grayish-white hair, bright violet eyes, and facial tattoo that went from his left eye down along his cheek and ending at the jawline, he had a sort of bad boy look to him. Too bad he was about 3 decades older than I was. Wait, what am I thinking? Bad Hikari. It's nice to meet you, Mizukage-sama. He grinned. Damn it, don't smile like that. You as well, Hokage-sama. Your parents speak greatly of your talents. Do they now? I smiled, equal parts amused and terrified. Knowing my parents. Ugh, I can only imagine what they really told him. It's all good, I assure you. He chuckled, then made a show of looking around inside the gate. I hoped that I picked up on his gesture and waved my hand. One of my Anbu dropped down behind me on a knee. Hokage-sama. Nodding at the Anbu operative, I switched my gaze to Yugura again. Do you and your escorts need a place to stay, Mizukage-sama, or did you already have plans? Yugura shook his head. Please, we're not here officially, so feel free to call me Yugura. I would appreciate a place to stay, though, since I doubt I'll be here for more than 3 or 4 days. Very well. I smiled. Then I insist you call me Hikari. He nodded before I turned to look at the Anbu, who was still kneeling. Bird, can you please show Yugura and his escort to the executive diplomatic suites? Let the staff know they'll need to prepare for 5 days. As the Anbu affirmed the order and rose to his feet, he gestured for the group to follow. I noticed Yugura was looking at me with a raised eyebrow, but I merely shrugged. Knowing my dad and my aunt, you may be here longer than you're expecting. Consider yourself warned. He chuckled and nodded, starting to move and follow the Anbu. Mikoto mentioned something to that effect. Waving his hand, he got his own escorts to fall in behind him, though they were busy looking around at everything to see in the village and muttering among themselves. As they started moving away, I felt an arm drape around my shoulders. Pulling the Hokage hat off of my head, I leaned into the shoulder hug, letting the warm presence and familiar chakra wash over me. How's my girl doing? As I heard my dad's voice again for the first time in a month, I felt a pleasant sensation run up my spine. It was a deep and comforting voice, and was one that I could listen to for hours. I know at times he was amazed as to how I managed to pay attention to his lessons to me when I was younger. I'm great, Dad. How about you? He chuckled, and the vibrations of that carried across my shoulder. I'm wonderful. It was a long trip, but Yugura is a pretty fun guy, as always. I'm glad to hear it. It's nice to finally meet him. My father hummed his agreement before releasing me, and then I turned to look at my mother. I seriously thought she was one of, if not the most beautiful woman in the entire village, but I can admit that may have been yet another bias of mine coming into play. In all seriousness, the woman was in her mid-40s, but barely looked a day over 30, and she had no Uzumaki genes to fall back on. That's not to say the difference wasn't more incredible in my father, as he was a year older than my mom, but he didn't look like he had aged a day past 25. It was just like my Aunt Kushina, and something to do with Uzumaki longevity. Uncle Nagato was still pretty spry for a 50-something, instead appearing to be in his 30s. If he wasn't always so thin he might look even younger. I seriously hoped that I inherited that longevity too, and that's not just my inner vanity talking. Anyway, my mother still had this alluring "I'm hot, but I can kill you before you blink" look going on. There was some sort of battle that happened where she lost her eyes before I was born, and I know they don't like to talk about it much, but she's always worn an eye patch ever since. In her other eye, I know that she had replaced her original eye with one from my grandfather because she was losing vision in it. That meant she had the eternal Mangekyo, but I'd never seen her do anything with it or even activate it for that matter. As a consequence of the exchange, however, her Sharingan was always active at its base level, but I thought it merely enhanced her look. After all, I could relate with how it felt to always have your Dojutsu active. My Rinnegan was the same way. I can still remember the day it activated like it was yesterday, mostly because it both saved my life coupled with the odd and fearful looks from my teammates and sensei. It made quite an impression on my then 16-year-old self. Luckily between my parents and Uncle Nagato, they helped me cope. The eyes were powerful. Of that there was no doubt, but with them also came a lot of responsibility. Considering I could bring back the recently deceased, if I was willing to part with some of my own life force in exchange? Yeah, try to not let it go to your head. Anyway, after greeting my mom and welcoming them both back, I peeled off my Hokage robe and we started walking back towards our old family home with them. They looked surprised at first that I was walking with them, but they didn't question it, so I didn't say anything. "So, are your brother and sister bouncing off the walls yet after graduating?" my mother asked. I couldn't help but chuckle. They were plenty energetic, certainly. I saw your clones in the crowd when I was offering my congratulations, and I think they're pretty excited to be placed on a team under Obito Ajusan. I had to hide the candy, or we may not have had a house left. Both of my parents chuckled. My mother seemed a little sad that we were all growing up, but she had confided in me a couple years ago that she wanted more children. Unfortunately, there were some complications during the birth of the twins, and Sanada-sama felt it wasn't safe for her health to have any more. I couldn't believe that my mom wanted 9 kids. Most clan families don't have more than 2, the so-called heir and a spare. Supposedly when my parents started dating, my dad jokingly asked for 9, and I immediately caught the Kyuubi reference. My mom was willing to go along with it at first because of both the uniqueness factor and she was newly in love, she confirmed, but then over time decided she actually wanted 9 children. She made it over halfway before she was told no more. Of course my dad was ecstatic with just Itachi, and each additional child doubled his happiness. But that's my dad for you. When we got to the house, I had to hide my grin as we entered into the foyer. I walked in and turned around, waiting for my parents. My mom walked in and turned on the light, only for a loud surprise to be announced behind me. My mom was honestly startled, but immediately started grinning. I don't think my dad was in on the planning of the birthday party for my mom, but he was always good at sensing chakra signatures, no matter how much they were suppressed. Likely something to do with him being a sage. I actually didn't find out about it until an hour ago, when Itachi stopped by again to make sure that yes, I really would be home tonight. I thought it was a great idea. Even if her birthday was a week ago, she wasn't here to celebrate, so everyone thought to throw her a party when she got back. It wasn't often we did parties like this, but for once everyone was able to get the day off, and I mean everyone. Orihime-san was here with her husband and son, as were all the students and their respective families. Obito, Anko, Yugao, Rin, Kakashi, Takuya, all of the Uzumakis plus Nagato with his 12-year-old niece. Even Naomi showed up, amazingly, though she looked like she was having a pity party in the corner. Oh well. As my mother went over to greet and thank everyone for the surprise, I looked at my dad. Actually, I had to do a quick double take, as I was pretty sure I saw tears in the corners of his eyes. "Dad? He responded, but he was obviously focused on the party and everyone gathered in the room. "Welcome home." For some reason, the words left my mouth before I could think of why I wanted to say them. Something about them just felt right. The smile he graced me with was absolutely blinding, and it was impossible to miss the single tear that made its way out of the corner of his eye to trail down his whisker-marked cheek. It's good to be here. The end. Additional info. Approx. 25.5 years since Naruto time travel. Naruto and Mikoto family. Naruto. 45 years old. Retired. Consultant. Mikoto. 44 years old. Retired. Their kids. Itachi. Male. 23 years old. Anbu commander. Plus his wife equals Sasuke 14 months old. Hikari. Female. 21 years old. Got him Hokage. Jiru. Male. 20 years old. Special Jonin. Amaya. Female. 16 years old. Chunin. Isamu. Male. 12 years old. Twin. Genin. Itsuko. Female. 12 years old. Twin. Genin. Minato and Kushina family. Minato. 42 years old. Retired Yondaime Hokage. Consultant. Kushina. 41 years old. Retired. Their kids. Naomi. Female. 20 years old. Special Jonin. Masahiro. Male. 18 years old. Special Jonin. Original Naruto generation. Chika. Female. 10 years old. Academy. End of chapter 18, and end of story. So Naruto x Makoto Uchiha, that's an unusual ship. But it was better than I was expecting, and it is so funny, Naruto become Itachi dad. If someone survived to this moment. What is your opinion about this fanfic? If you like this, please support the author. So this is everything for now. Please have a nice day, and see you in the next story. Bye.